Thanks everyone for joining us this evening to hear from UrbanVision about the Conservation Area Appraisal that they're undertaking on behalf of the town. It is very important to the Faversham Society that this Conservation Area Appraisal takes place. We've been pushing for it for a while because we realise that with the neighbourhood plan going through the process of being brought into force, it's really important that we have an up-to-date Conservation Area Appraisal so that any development within the town that impacts on the conservation area is done in a way which is sympathetic to the existing cultural and conservation status of the town. So Dave, I think you're going to kick this off and tell us what a conservation area is and what a conservation area appraisal does.
Sure, yeah. Okay, so a conservation area is, as defined in law, it's an area of special architectural or historic interest, the character or appearance of which it's desirable to preserve or enhance. So a bit of a mouthful, but essentially it's a historic area with architectural, historic interest, and they vary greatly in size, in nature, and they're designated by local authorities. So Faversham actually is a really, really big conservation area. It must be one of the bigger ones in the country. And because of that, it's quite varied. It includes various phases of development of the town, from the medieval town and port, the earlier days, through quite a lot of change through the Georgian era, then industrialization and housing expansion in the 19th and early 20th centuries. So there's around the railway expansion. So there's a very, very varied character from Davington in the north to the housing areas south of the railway. But overall, it's an area of special architectural and historic interest, and it's just worth pointing out the conservation area has been extended over time, and not least as our understanding of heritage has changed over the decades, and particularly our perceptions of the 19th century, then the 20th century, and of industrial heritage and the like. Our ideas of what heritage is have developed over time. So the exercise we've been asked to do is a character appraisal and management plan. So it's good practice for conservation areas to have a character appraisal, which really looks in detail at the area and tries to define what its special architectural or historic interest in character is all about. And a management plan, which is sort of positive proposals for taking the conservation area forward. So we've been working on this for a few months now, and we've been doing that in parallel as well to support work on the neighbourhood plan. And obviously there's been an interaction between those, with the work we're doing on the character appraisal informing the neighbourhood plan and vice versa. So doing the two in parallel has actually been quite a positive exercise, I think. So with an area that size, it is challenging, and particularly early on, we struggled a little with whether a character appraisal should be area-based first and foremost, and then dealing with different aspects of special interest in character, or whether we should try and look at what the special interest is in a more universal way. So what I've ended up doing is looking generally at the special interest in character appearance, and I've done that by time of development, because actually the areas are based on different phases of development as well. So I've basically looked at different phases of development, and then done that in a history, a very, very concise history, but then also looking at building development over time, looking at townscape characteristics, and again, the different areas have different kind of characteristics. Looking at the importance of landscape, which the Faversham Conservation Area landscape is a much more important element than in many conservation areas. You know, looking at materials over time, construction, etc. So we've run through how the town has developed over time, the more important buildings over time, and then we've got a next section, which is a sort of a summary, really, of that overall assessment of special interest, but then a summary of 5 areas as well, where we're just trying to do a snapshot of what that area is about. So we've incorporated both general development over time, and the different areas in the conservation area to try and create as clear a picture as possible of what the special interest and character is all about. And that seems to have worked okay, but it did take a little bit of working out how we could best define the area. And some, you know, a lot of the character is based on contrasts, actually, where for example, the medieval town, which is a very organic, informal and vernacular sort of approach, contrasts completely with what the Georgians did in the town, which is formal, inspired by European classical architecture. So she could barely have a greater contrast between the early parts of the town and then what happened through the Georgian era, and then in Victorian Edwardian period, the more utilitarian, industrial and buildings and housing, which the utilitarian character is part of the charm, really, and but also much more eclectic approach to public buildings or commercial buildings. So we see these real contrasts occurring over time. So the document is also a management plan, and what we've tried to do in the management plan is we've really divided it into the sort of economic side of things, and really looking at planning, protection, and the more administrative side, applying the legislation, etc. So in the management plan, we're looking partly at how to realise the cultural, economic, community potential of heritage, so identifying the values heritage has. And a lot of people understand the cultural values, but actually heritage has real economic and social value in the present as well. Most heritage is in productive use. It's part of the infrastructure of modern Faversham. It's in use. So realising the economic potential is the means, not only of making sure heritage does it's good for the town and helps the town, but it's also the means to preservation. It's making sure that heritage remains in productive use for the sustainable uses now and in the future. So there's a synergy between the economic value and potential of heritage and conservation of heritage. I think sometimes heritage is presented as a polarized thing, where it's growth or protection, and what we're trying to get across in the document is that that's a bit of a false dichotomy. They're actually mutually supportive objectives. So the management plan looks at what's protected, looks at whether there's a need to change the nature of that protection, or to improve records on heritage. The economic side is more making sure that the town remains viable, that the town continues to adapt, and heritage has its role in achieving that. So in a nutshell, that's what the document is about. When we've finished or we have a draft of the document, it will have to go out to public consultation. So Swale Council will do that, and then the document, once it's finalised, it'll then be used to inform planning decision making, to inform future strategies and future policies. And one of the things we're going to emphasise in the management plan is that what works best is where different plans and strategies work together and different organisations work together to one script, really, and to a coherent set of proposals. So we're going to be emphasising, although it has a heritage focus, really the aim is to make sure heritage is built into all plans and strategies, and that it, you know, that the various benefits it delivers to the town are appreciated. Okay, that's it in a 10-minute or 15-minute or however long that was.
Dave, thanks very much for that. We've had some questions come in inevitably on the chat. Some of the people have asked, can the conservation area be extended? Has it been extended in the past? Or does it grow over time as more buildings become historically important?
So there is a requirement in law from time to time to consider the boundaries of the conservation area, and so Faversham has been extended in the past, and it's entirely possible that you know, it could change again. So yeah, I mean, that's part of the ongoing process, and it's been amended at least once and possibly a couple of times, I think, over time. In fact, no, I think it's been amended more often than that. You probably know better than I do, actually. But
McNade Avenue, for example, seems to me to be an area that's not currently the conservation area, but which is unusual. I mean, it's that London almost garden suburb style development, which is quite rare in Kent, and that's not, I think, in the conservation area. Will you be looking at things like that?
So we've been asked in general terms to look at that, and I know the society has made various suggestions which will pass to Swale to have a look at. So we haven't been asked to come up with a new boundary, but it is an issue we'll address in the management plan.
You're able to do that.
Yeah, and we've been asked as well to comment on whether the Article 4 directions are adequate. An Article 4 direction brings in additional controls over things like doors, windows, and there is an Article 4 direction, or indeed Article 4 directions, which protect certain characteristics of the area, but we've been asked to look at whether that's adequate, and we've also been asked to consider advertisements as well, and whether additional controls on advertisements would be useful.
Would certainly help to preserve our streetscapes, I think, if we did additional controls.
So we've been asked to look at this in general terms rather than to draw up the detail of say, extensions or new Article 4s. So the document will do that, yeah.
In your experience, Dave, is Faversham unusual having such a range of historic periods well represented?
They're really different, actually. So a lot of very historic towns actually would be like Faversham. So you know, but it's a big conservation area, and it covers really the development of the town over centuries. Quite often they're broken down more, so you'd have different conservation areas rather than one that big. Or sometimes you'll have a conservation area which is actually it's from one period of construction. You know, it's a coherent thing. So there's, for example, we looked at conservation areas in 2 London garden suburbs, and they were much more a character across the area, if you like, rather than, and the period of construction was much more, much tighter. But they totally vary completely. I think Faversham's size is why it's got such a diverse character, and the extent of landscape. Conservation areas are often used for more for built heritage, but with Faversham, the landscape is such a fundamental part of the character that there's actually quite extensive landscape areas within the boundary, and that's more unusual. I would say.
Dave, we've had a question about views of listed buildings, one of which is obviously, or two of which is the Abbey Barnes site, which is pretty invisible actually from most of the town of Faversham, except from New Creek Road, where there's a view across from what is very new, almost pastiche housing, but it's one of the few views across to the listed barns, and that's I think a 1 and a 2 star. Is that something that the Conservation Area Appraisal can assist with protecting?
Well, it can identify views. Now, obviously, with an area of this size, you could identify 10,000. It's so what it's done. It's more. It's identified types of view. Obviously, there's street vistas throughout the area, and there's no need to map all of those. We know there are street vistas, so we're just giving an example or two of those. But clearly, your landmark buildings, your higher industrial buildings or church towers and spires, things like that. We've highlighted that the views towards them are important, but inevitably with an area this size, it's more identifying the type of view and the type of landmark rather than we could have spent the whole budget just doing detailed mapping of views, which and ultimately, actually, I think identifying the types of view and structure can be more useful ultimately. So we've certainly done that.
But I think what the person who's asking the question is getting at is that is actually quite a difficult site to see. Therefore, where there is a view of it, presumably that is worth conserving so that the buildings can be seen. Otherwise, they become invisible, don't they?
Yeah, the neighbourhood plan does some of that, and it does that through policy. So this isn't a policy document; it's an evidence document. Right. So it doesn't have protective policies or things like that. That would be for the neighbourhood plan and the local plan, or indeed for representations on specific planning applications to point that out. So this is an evidence document. So it will inform future policy and decisions, but it's not actual policy. It's not planning policy.
Hannah, I know you've done some work in Berwick, and I'm quite fond of Berwick. One of the things they have there that I think's very exciting is this cube map style introduction to the historic areas of Berwick, which has some things in common with Faversham, but it's a significantly different place. Do you think that cube map idea, so that people are directed to the Victorian and the Georgian areas, would work well in Faversham?
I think a project like that for the Faversham Society would really help to show people and get people to explore the diversity of actually what you have in the conservation area, because that's one of the really unusual things, is how large the conservation area is. Dave and I didn't have to pack our compede, but we were certainly prepared to do it, covering the length and breadth of the conservation area on our few days tour. But something like that helps to bring quite graphically together all those different periods so people get a bit of an understanding of what the townscape actually delivers. So a project like that for the Faversham Society would certainly help interpret what the Conservation Area Appraisal has in its zones that it's sort of identified.
We'll see what we can do, Hannah. I'll have to try and find some volunteers who I can persuade to do it. One of the areas I'm aware of, maybe two areas I'm aware of that are probably undervalued, three undervalued in Faversham. There's the Tanner Street area, which is, some people say, is where Faversham was first based, and obviously it is where the Tanners were. There's Newton Road, where those Victorian mansions on the left of Newton Road as you walk up to the railway station, are almost unnoticed by people. But I look around other towns and I don't see Victorian buildings of that quality very often. I mean, they're late Victorian, but they've got some very attractive detailing on these massive buildings. And the third question, I guess, is we don't have much 1960s architecture. I mean, obviously the post office is probably the most prominent 1960s building we've got. Do you think we should be trying to get these things listed?
So one of the things we're writing into the management plan is to look at things missing from the list, or to look at the grading in some instances. Now, some buildings, the post office is interesting because there's very little from the interwar and post-war years. There's very, very little. And so the post office has a protection as a building in a conservation area. Whether it be listable is questionable, but it's certainly a key building in the conservation area. And given the lack of buildings from that period, I've explicitly recognised it in the character appraisal as actually being quite unusual as a Scandinavian influenced, post-war Scandinavian influence, sometimes referred to as the new humanism or the new empiricism, and listed or not, and the same with other buildings, listed or not, it's I think with later periods I've noticed there's less listed and the grades tend to be lower. So when I was looking at the medieval period, there's an awful lot of high grade buildings, then some, but less so, from the Georgian era that again tend to be grade 2 or actually not listed, but important to recognise the collective contribution of terraces, housing terraces. So I picked the post office out just to really raise awareness of, to raise awareness that there's so little from that period. I think one of the questions this brings out is why there is so little from the interwar and post-war years. So there can be a number of reasons for that, I think. But also I've noticed as well, with recent development or new development, there's a definite imitative rather than creative response to the context, and also there's we live in quite an alarming age in terms of developing evidence on climate change, but again there's little explicit response to that in recent housing, and you would expect to start to see that. So I think one of the things we want to get across is that the conservation area isn't, it shouldn't be assumed that's about imitation. And actually what's happened in the past, what's created the character, is the total contrast between medieval Faversham, what the Georgians did, and then what the Victorians did. And in no way was that imitation. And I wonder whether we've lost sight of that through the 20th and 21st century, and whether so one of the things bringing out of the document really is the conservation area shouldn't be seen as implying imitation. In fact, the character wouldn't be what it is if that had been the approach through the ages, and one of the challenges is how to do, I think, a legitimate heritage from the 21st century now.
Yeah, particularly since the way the buildings are being built, they may not last as long as some of the buildings from the Victorian and the Victorian and Georgian periods. So it'll be interesting to see how many of them just get washed away by floods.
Yeah.
But I mean, the latest flood maps for Faversham make very depressing viewing, I have to say. Quite a big part of the town centre is subject to flooding. There's, I think, possibly the final question come in, Dave, unless, Hannah, I don't know if you feel there's anything that we've missed in this, but people are asking Dave whether the Faversham Society is going to get a chance to comment on this before it goes to Swale.
So we'd have to put the question to the client. Obviously, that's for the client to decide. But obviously, we're happy to interact with the society, and if Swale are happy for that to happen, then you know, we could go through the document with you. But it's a question for them as the client. We can't answer on their behalf. You know.
Do you put that question to your client, or do we?
Well, it may be good coming from the society, I think, and you know, just saying as part of I mean, obviously for us it would be useful because we get more local input into the document as well. But it's really how Swale want to play that. So if you want to raise it with them, perhaps it's best coming from you in the first instance. What do you think, Hannah?
I think if we let them know, Harold, if you do email the conservation and design team and then say, you know, that we've done together this evening, and building on that, is that an opportunity that they can let you explore, then that's going to help to inform the document with some more of that detail potentially, and also that you can suggest that you can help when it comes to their consultation that they have to do, because ultimately, you know, that can be supported with the society, and perhaps it's a joint event as part of your program anyway. You know, wouldn't it be nice to think that the management plan public meeting would actually be part of a walking tour? As we've identified, you know, there's been great elements that the society's been able to influence on live planning applications, you know, and there's potential awards that you might develop as other projects from that, and that'll be all part of that discussion that you can have with the conservation and design team at Swale.
Are you funded to come down for another visit, or is your funding now exhausted?
Hannah, I'm not sure if you are. I haven't got another visit.
I haven't. Down. I haven't directly.
So
no.
the consultation with Faversham Society would be difficult, wouldn't it?
Well, it'd be online. It'd be something to do online, I think.
Yeah. Well, in some ways, those consultations almost work better online, don't they? Because you can actually look at text and drawings and so on that way more easily often than in a public meeting.
So there will be a formal consultation where the whole document goes out to consultation, and they'll be able to you know, comment then. But what I think might be useful if Swale are happy with it is a more limited conversation, just to really fact check the document and pick up any you know any real
clangers.
Issues. Yeah, clangers. That's the word it's after. Yeah, pick up any clangers before it actually goes into the public realm. So, you know, if Swale were happy with that, we could do maybe just a limited look at the document. Some, you know, you and a couple of colleagues maybe to do the fact check, and then it goes out to consultation and everyone sees it.
Yeah, it'd be interesting to see. I mean, I'm sure Swale wouldn't really want to have to do to have our views given in public if we hadn't had a chance to influence the thing beforehand.
Yeah.
Somebody's just reminded me actually on the chat about Ethelbert Road, which was a really interesting, very sympathetic redevelopment part of the old secondary school as housing. A really an exemplary example, in my view at least, of the reuse of a conservation grade building which had otherwise become redundant. I don't know if you had time to look at that in your review of the area.
So we're getting into a certain level of detail, and we have identified key buildings. So we've done that on the basis of is that the quadrangle building?
Yeah.
Is it a quadrangle formation? So yeah, what I've done, I've identified mainly the high grade stuff, particularly in the medieval section. It's the high grade stuff because there's so much listed fabric as well that. But then I've been more selective as we've come forward. So I think that's a grade 2. Oh, I'm not sure if it's a grade 2 or 2-star offhand, but I think it's grade 2. But I mentioned it because it's so distinctive. You know, it's such a distinctive example. So we have in the later periods, we have drawn on grade 2 buildings as well, or even unlisted. But it's been inevitably, there's so much in the area, and there's so many listed buildings in the area, that it's been a case of being really selective and more giving examples of key buildings from each period, rather than the thing is trying to keep the documents as usable as possible, because I've seen character appraisals that are 150 pages long and full of description, and it's impossible to use. So for the policymakers, decision makers, they just can't use it because there's just so much detail and so much description. So what we've tried to do instead is to define the special architectural or historic interest and character, to describe them, and with key examples, but not to try and record the vast range of stuff there, because it makes the document less useful rather than more useful. So we've really thought who's going to be using the document, how it's going to be used, and then tried to gear it to that level, you know.
Thanks very much indeed, David. We haven't had any more questions come through on the chat. Hannah, I don't know if there's anything from a neighbourhood plan perspective you want to add in wrapping up.
I think just to say how these documents can work in parallel together. So think of this as part of the evidence base, and it's really important to actively use that conservation area appraisal and that management plan when thinking about how those neighbourhood plan policies are actually going to apply. So when you're thinking about any development proposal that comes forward, how does it meet the policies in the neighbourhood plan, and then you can support that with the evidence from the conservation area appraisal. So it's remembering to use both parts of that together.
Well, can I thank you very much indeed, Hannah. Dave, can I thank you as well? It's been a really enlightening 40 minutes, so thank you very much indeed. We will put this up on the Faversham Society website in due course and draw people's attention to it.
Okay,
Lovely.
cheers.